welcome to this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger, and today we're going to discuss the topic of pressure, how to prepare for higher pressure situations, whether they be certain types of matches, certain types of tournaments, also how to handle pressure in the moment and how to prepare for higher pressure moments that might occur. And we're also going to talk about some of the barriers to playing well under pressure. In terms of some of the perspectives that you might have, and also how other people can fit into things in terms of the expectations and the judgments, or sometimes the perceived expectations and judgments of others, and the impact that that can place on us or on certain athletes in terms of performing well under pressure. So why don't we start with some of the barriers in terms of barriers to playing well under pressure, in terms of Brian, I guess as you start to think about this topic of pressure and of, performing well, how do you start to think about some of these barriers and some of the things that ultimately holds athletes back in terms of playing their best?
Yeah, I think these are some topics we've touched on in past episodes. So when we feel pressure, it creates certain emotions, which then lead to certain behaviors. But sometimes the root is expectations, or that's one of the issues, right? Is that we perhaps have some specific expectations about how we want to play or perform. It could even be expectations that I should win or our team should win, which is, I think, one of the most dangerous statements in all of tennis is I should win. Because that automatically establishes an expectation and puts more pressure on you, because what's going to happen if you don't? How are you going to be able to respond to the fact that you told everyone you should win? So I think expectations are something to really look at. What are our expectations? Are they realistic? And we can certainly get into more of this when we begin to look at some ways of getting through it. But we've mentioned Ika Swiatek and the whole idea of keep expectations low and standards high. And there's a reason for that, because she and her sports psych know that when you have high expectations, that does tend to put more pressure on the player. That begins oftentimes to make us start to think about what's going to go wrong. I think as human beings, that tends to be our natural inclination, is to think of the negative consequence. And of course, there's a bit of, sort of ancient software in our brains that has helped our species survive because of that negativity bias of looking for threats out there. And I think that's really what's in play here is our threat detector is seeing something, it's sensing some danger to what's going on. And maybe it's not like real life and death danger. Of course it's not. That generally doesn't happen on the tennis court. But what's it a danger to? It could be a danger just to our identity of we think we're good tennis players. And perhaps my not succeeding in this situation is a threat to that. Maybe I won't think I'm a good tennis player. Maybe my teammates or my friends or parents or family won't think I'm a good tennis player if I have this loss or don't play well. So I think a lot of it does start with some of those expectations, Josh, and then how they drive us to think a little bit more negatively. So like what's your starting point with this?
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of important points there in terms of keeping standards high, but expectations low. Not ever saying that we should win a match or we're supposed to win a match or anything like that. But having high standards for ourselves in terms of leading into a match or tournament. Okay, am I doing everything that I can in terms of my preparation? Am I my sleep, my nutrition, hydration? Am I mentally preparing or mentally rehearsing the way that I want to? Is my bag fully packed ahead of time so I'm not scrambling leading up to that match? Have I thought about my strategy and maybe a game plan or plan B leading up to that match? Am I doing all of the little things right to give myself the best possible chance? Am I controlling everything that can be controlled going up into that match? So am I in terms of my standards, am I doing everything within my capacity to perform well? Is really where I would start. But when working with an athlete, are we setting ourselves up for success for this high pressure moment, rather than thinking about it in a way of what could go wrong, right? As you mentioned, right? We don't want to think, a lot of times people in these high pressure situations, they almost start to visualize the worst case scenario. They start to think about, okay, what if I feel so tight, then I'm not going to perform well, and then I'm going to be double faulting, and it's almost can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So rather than allowing our wheels to turn like that, and sort of get too ahead of ourselves in terms of these worst case scenarios, thinking about controlling whatever is possible to control and having high standards for ourselves in terms of those things, in terms of, okay, if we want to be focusing on feeling good physically, we need to make sure that we're prioritizing our sleep, or we need to make sure if we think that if we know that our opponent, and we need to make sure that we have done our due diligence in terms of really thinking through what that game plan is going to be. Or we've talked in previous episodes about challenging opponents, or in terms of handling various situations that you might get into on the court. But are we spending that time going into the match thinking through some of these scenarios and really preparing in the best possible way? So the way that I think about it is, okay, are we doing our homework? Are we doing everything possible leading up to that match to give ourselves the best chance, rather than starting to think in these destructive ways in terms of, I should win, I need to win, what if I don't win? These outcome based thinking ultimately isn't going to be helping us, but doing these little things right, and focusing on having high standards of ourselves is going to start to give us that best possible chance and help us to combat that pressure and nerves that maybe we're feeling leading up to the match, and also in the match or in the moment itself.
Yeah, and I think I think we have to examine how we're thinking about that event, or we're also going to talk about, say, pressure points in different circumstances. But how are we thinking about that event? And a really good way to start to shift your thinking is through an exercise that we call like appraisal, like stress appraisal. So whenever a situation occurs in our lives, we want to understand, how we view it. Is it a threat? Is it an opportunity? Let's write about it a little bit. And if we were to take sort of this scenario where someone's looking at a pressure match and they're thinking about those things that could go wrong, not playing well, that drives then a certain set of emotions, which also changes how you feel physiologically, right? You are now changing your body chemistry in such a way. You may even be kicking off the fight or flight syndrome. And these are all things that are going to block your ability to play well. So when we have that sort of threat mindset, when our body chemistry becomes more or less corrupted, we tend to tighten up. We tend to Our vision tends to narrow, right? We don't see quite as well out there. In fact, you may be looking all around. In tennis, that could be, what could be indicating that is a player who is maybe pulling their head up every time that they're hitting a shot. They may be shanking a few of those. It's an indication, that their head is moving because they feel anxiety. Um, they may also have tension in their body, which is then corrupting their technique, corrupting their rhythm, their tempo, their balance. And so it's good to, I think, to understand the physiological components of what is happening when we start to look at the negative outcome piece or the threat piece of things. Um, because we have to, if we're going to find ourselves back or get our way back to playing well, it has to go back to, all right, how do I start to manage my physiology a little bit better so that I can feel better. And then once you start to feel better, you're more likely to play well. Um, and those are the controllables. Those are some of the things that you were mentioning, Josh. But very often, when we begin to think about these pressure situations, it's very results, results, results. And I think even playing well to a certain extent is a result or an outcome, especially in a sport like tennis, where you have somebody on the other side of the net who's pretty invested in you not playing well. Part of their job is to not let you do what you want to do, and that's also part of your job is not let them do what they want to do, to exploit their weaknesses. Um, so, when I'm talking about like this stress appraisal, it's a really good way to understand how you're viewing, this particular event, and you can really just free form write it. Everything that you're thinking, get all the good, the bad, the ugly out there on paper, and then you can start examining some of the things that you're saying about this particular event, like, oh, I need to win. I have to win. I have to play perfectly, or I should win. Some of these statements are perhaps irrational, like the whole need to win piece, or I have to be perfect. It's not really rational. I should win, not productive. So there are some things that may be irrational. There might be some things that are simply not true in there. So it's really good to go through, I think, how you're thinking of a match and being critical of, all right, what evidence do I have that this needs to happen? I think we've talked about this before. The whole "I should win" piece is being, it's obviously too result oriented, but it also, we all know from a tennis perspective, no one, I mean, you got to earn it. There's no should. I mean, or should win. The pros don't say that. I think, and the best way to talk about it is the way a pro would handle a pre-match interview. They don't say, "Oh yeah, this guy, he's not that good. I should be done in about 45 minutes, and I'll see you in the post-match interview." Um, it doesn't happen that way. It's disrespectful, but we can't control results, and so every pro will often say something nice about their opponent. He or she has been playing well, a lot of confidence, and then they bring it back to themselves. Hey, but I'm playing well too. I've had a great week of practice. And match starts from zero. See where it goes from there, but I'm just going to go out and give it my best, and we'll see what happens. And that's kind of shifting from, hey, maybe we're thinking about the result, but now we're bringing it back down to what we can control in that moment. And so, and when we get to the sort of the good practices, sort of solutions for pressure, I'll talk about the other half of that appraisal exercise. But really, the first half is simply writing down how you're feeling about a particular event. Don't keep it all rattling around in your head. Get it on paper. See what it really looks like. And it will probably be quite illuminating for you to see what you're actually thinking, and then we can deal with that after that.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point there in terms of once you get it out on paper, it's not banging around in your head anymore. It can be dealt with. It can be handled. You can come up with a plan, or you can actually address it. But when it's just in your head, it's you're ruminating about it. It's not in a helpful place. It's not productive in that when you're in that frame of mind. I also wanted to go back to another thing that you said earlier about when somebody is experiencing that pressure in the moment, that oftentimes their vision can be narrowed, almost like a tunnel vision. One thing that I've seen with some of the players I've worked with, more on court, is sometimes that manifests in terms of being distracted or almost fixating on some minor detail that is totally outside of their control, like a fan in the audience, and just being so annoyed and fixated on that fan that rather than them thinking about anything to do with their game, like their strategy or their footwork or their mindset or anything, they're like focused on this fan outside, or maybe it's the opponent, or maybe it's the official. or maybe it's the court conditions or something like that. But they're so focused on that, and that maybe it's every changeover or any time in between points that's all that it's very clear that is the headspace that they're in. They're wrapped up in that one thing. And I think when players are experiencing pressure, and I think this even manifests at the professional levels at times, and you see this, but less so. But it can come out like that. It can come out as as focusing on something totally out of our control, and to the detriment of the rest of their game.
So I have a question for you on that, Josh. So,
Yeah.
do you think that is sometimes help giving them an excuse later on after the match in a way that they can protect their self-esteem? Like, hey, this happened, so and so is doing this. I didn't really lose per se, but that happened, and so what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think players will come up with those excuses oftentimes,
Yeah.
whether it's the court conditions, whether it's that annoying fan, whether it's the racket wasn't strung the right way. But I think what's important for athletes is to find that mindset of, hey, whatever's going on, I'm going to be stronger. I'm going to be a warrior, and I'm going to be able to fight through it. And this is as we've talked about in the show in past episodes, this competition is a test for me, right? Am I able to withstand all of these outside factors, all of these challenging conditions, and still, despite all that, still perform well? But no, I think I often see that. I mean, I think our listeners have probably either experienced this or have seen this in others, that if you can't find a way to win, oftentimes people will find some sort of excuse. And maybe it's the court conditions, or maybe it's something to do with the opponent, or maybe it's something to do with us, like an injury or our racket strung. And maybe each of those factors did influence the outcome. But when we're focused on it to such an extreme, then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy that we do end up losing, and the only thing we can point to is that excuse or that quote unquote reason why we lost that match. So I think that's important, and I think people do that to protect themselves, right? To protect their ego and to say, oh, I didn't lose because I was the weaker player. I lost because of blank. I lost because of my opponent was so annoying, or whatever it was. My racket was strong.
Made one bad call or something.
Exactly. It was that one call, three games into the match, and I fell apart after that. Or whatever. My racket was strung a few pounds too loose, and I couldn't control the ball, or something like that. So I think, as it relates to pressure, I think it's important that we're able to broaden that vision and to get out of that tunnel, that tunnel mind, that tunnel vision, that sort of mindset. And I think, just even something like taking a couple deep breaths can sometimes help us to get back into the moment, can help us to gain a little bit more clarity about, what's going on in this situation. What's important now, an acronym we've used in the past, and not just be focused and fixated on whatever it is where our attention is in that moment, right? Where trying to be mindful of where our attention is, and then having the ability, and it's really a skill, to shift that attention and maybe broaden it if need be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's a lot of good stuff there, and I think, one perhaps equation we can use. I think Sean Brawley mentioned this in our episode with him. I would call it the performance equation. Is actual performance equals potential performance minus interference. And so when you go through that exercise of how you're thinking about a particular event, or even thinking about how you've handled pressure moments in the past and maybe have not done well, um, the things that have gotten in the way, those are your sources of interference.
Yep.
And the nice thing about, again, writing this stuff out and using that equation, because we have two levers in that equation that we can increase. Now, you could increase your potential, but generally that's not going to happen for one match. That's a career type of thing. So over the span of your career, yes, your potential performance will get better and better. But if we're looking at, a match coming up, your only lever there is how do I reduce sources of interference? And to do that, you have to understand what the sources of interference are. Because we've talked about many times the best way to reach your best performance is to reduce pressure as much as possible. And we've had some great perspectives shared with us on this podcast. Brian Barker talking about focusing more on, just playing well and being the best person you can be. One I really loved is from Christina Rollo and Dave DeHaan. Everything is practice. And that may not be something you tell your teammates, right, or or other people.
For your doubles
Um, yeah,
partner.
but you might tell them after you played great, because if we're taking the long term view, that the ultimate goal is, maybe not necessarily just to win this big match that we've got coming up, but it actually is to become the best tennis player you can become. And today's match or tomorrow's match is a step on that journey. And don't you want to bring your best game to that match? And if you're looking at this equation and you've got all these sources of interference, you're clearly not doing that. So all you're doing is getting more reps at a game that you don't even want to play. So why would you do that? It doesn't really make any sense. So I will often say this to players, and it does sound a little bit weird, but hopefully it makes sense to everyone who's listening. If you're going to lose with your A game. You learn a lot more by trying to do the right things than by avoiding doing the right things. In that latter scenario, the only thing you learn is, don't do that. That's it. It basically stops there. But if you try to go out and play your real game, even if you lose, now you have learned about certain adjustments that you can make so that the next time it gets better. You've actually practiced your true game in a pressure environment, and that is going to really count toward your development as a player. So I do really like that everything is practice. It can be is probably one of those things we keep to ourselves for the most part. Don't necessarily share that with everybody, but when we're talking about reducing sources of interference and understanding that very basic equation, it's one way to reduce pressure. When you think of like that equation, Josh, and reducing pressure, what are some other perspectives that you think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. I mean, I think this perspective on everything being practice and everything being practice for something else in the future, right? So we have it's very easy to fall into this trap of, okay, we have this match coming up. This is the end all be all. I'm focused on this match. All I can think about is this match. But to be able to shift that focus on, okay, this match is going to help me for the rest of the season or the rest of my career as a tennis player in terms of this journey, this project that I'm on, in terms of of mastering the sport, in terms of being as good of a player and as good of a competitor as I can ultimately be. I actually wanted to push you on a topic and ask, go back to something that you were saying in terms of, if you're going to lose with your A game. I guess my question is, how do we find that fine line, or I guess that balance between playing with our A game and playing, our best brand of tennis,
Yep.
and being willing to make those adjustments and maybe utilize a plan B or shift a game style if something's not working. For instance, let's say there's a player who plays very aggressively, and on that particular day, they're all over the place. They're hitting unforced errors. Not that they want to go to becoming a counterpuncher, retriever type player, but maybe there's an adjustment that can be made in terms of adding a bit more spin, or in terms of not pulling the trigger quite as often. So how do we help players find that balance between sticking with their brand of tennis that they're best at, and also being willing to make adjustments when as needed?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think what I would say is because even in the winner's creed, Bill Timm's winner's creed says you have to change a losing game. Um, but if you're not playing your best, is it a losing game? Perhaps not. So when I look at that about changing your game, if the opponent is handling what you do and you're playing well and they're beating you, then you change. If you have not yet found your game, but believe that if you do find your game, um, it will help you beat the opponent, then I say keep trying to find your game. So that would be the distinction I would make there, and maybe there's a fine line on that. I know what you mean, right? Because hey, it's a big match. I play aggressively. I'm just making errors all over the place. Um, yeah, should I switch? The thing is, you're going to switch. You got this big match you need to win. You're going to switch to a game plan you're probably not that good at. And that's what you're going to go out on? I'm not
Right.
sure, right? Again, if you are playing a match and you're playing well and your opponent is handling you, then you absolutely need to change something. Now, maybe you change it within the context of what you're good at. So maybe you're an aggressive baseliner. Maybe you start to serve and volley a little bit, or chip and charge, right? Do something within the framework of you being aggressive. Um, if you need to start chipping and pushing and moonballing, and you can do it, then that's another option. But I think today, lots of players don't have so many options. And so I guess, what do you think of that? Do you think that that makes sense? Like if you haven't found your A game and you're losing, that it makes sense to try to find your A game, and then if you've got your A game working and you're getting beat at it, then change.
I think overall that's a good framework. I think it depends a little bit on the person. I think there are some people that play a certain or I think some people are more or less capable of playing in different ways. Or
Yeah,
maybe if somebody is an all-court player and they have the offensive skills where they can, hit winners or finish points at the net, and they also have the ability to defend a little bit more and run down balls, then maybe that sort of player has more options in terms of
right.
if something's not working, they're more capable or maybe more willing to make that change. Or if somebody is a strict serve and volleyer and they're going to serve and volley on every point, or a strict grinder baseline, defensive player more on that side, they may be a little bit more limited in terms of making that change. But I think philosophically, we do want to go out with our best stuff. We want to when the match is on the line, we want to be playing our best brand of tennis. Our that we want to be going with the shots that brought us to this point in the first place,
Yeah,
rather than being hesitant or sticking with our plan B or our plan C. I do think it's important to me. I think back to Winning Ugly, in terms of being aware in a match of who's doing what to whom, and having that awareness to recognize, hey, my backhand is being broken down right now. Let's say, right, my backhand is being attacked. So rather than just sticking with that same thing, maybe there's something slightly different. Maybe I need to move my feet more so that it's not as easy for my opponent to get to my backhand. Maybe I need to slice it more. Maybe I need to, hit with some more spin and, give the ball some more air so that I can, play some better defense with my backhand or whatever it is. So I don't think that adjustment that's made necessarily needs to radically shift our entire orientation of our game from
right.
a player who's predominantly aggressive to a player who's more defensive. But I think it's tough because I generally think you want to stick with your best brand of tennis, and I think if you look at the pro level, the pros are the best at that, at trying to find that best brand of tennis, even when they don't have it. But they're also constantly tweaking and making adjustments.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
And I think when we look at this question, it's like, maybe we're looking for like these massive adjustments where it's not necessary, right? Like, can you really ever imagine Roger Federer changing much in a match? Probably not, And I think when I think of this question, I think of two players, one who is very one dimensional, which is Maria Sharapova. So, she would often lose first sets and be missing things. And her answer to that would usually be to hit harder. And very often, she'd find her game in the second set and then win in the third. And I think that's a good example of not radically shifting what you do, trying to find your A game, knowing that if you do find your A game, you're probably in the match. Um, I think, the other piece that you're mentioning here are subtle shifts. Absolutely. You can be changing that. So if we're talking, a major shift would be, going from aggressive to counterpuncher to, you know, conservative moonballing, right? Those are probably things that are of desperation, um, rather than, all right, you know what, I need to slice my backhand a little bit more. I need to just get the ball up a little bit higher to so and so's backhand. I think those are also adjustments one can make within the framework of your best game. Doesn't have to be looked at as a plan B per se. Hopefully, it's just a feature of plan A as well. So that I guess where I was going with this whole point was that very often when we feel pressure, we revert back to some sort of conservative game, and whether we push or we're just getting the ball in, we get tight, and it feels terrible
Mhm.
to play that way. And what are you really practicing when you play that way? You're just more or less perfecting this threat response and how you react to pressure. Where there's a part of me, and you wouldn't necessarily do this in a big pressure event, but go out, find some, smaller event or practice match, and just really trying to practice with that A game and just letting it rip and see, even if you're missing everything, at least you're learning something about how to adjust it versus you're always holding back and taking zero risks, not being creative whatsoever.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I look back to my junior career, and at times during college as well, where if I wasn't playing well or wasn't finding rhythm, I would go back to a playing style of just sort of let's get the ball in, let's be consistent, which for me would look like let's slice my backhand,
Yeah.
let's maybe chip my forehand at times, or use sort of loop the ball rather than really hitting through it, or actually going for my shots. So I definitely agree broadly that we if you're going to go out, you don't want to go out with regrets that you
Yeah.
didn't go for it. You
Yeah.
didn't go for it, or you were hesitant, or you were scared to play your game. And I tell players this on the coaching side all the time, that um, even just in terms of actually making the ball on the court, if you're just sort of trying to guide the ball and just guide your shot and not finishing your shot because you're just trying to control it, that it's not going to work as well as trying to stay loose and committing to finishing your stroke, or committing to going for your shot. There's something almost counterintuitive there, that if you're willing to let go a little bit and let go of the result of getting the ball in and just trusting your shot, it ends up working out a lot better for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and even as we were talking, I was actually thinking of an example of a match that I've played where I was playing really well, and this guy from Spain, we were playing 35 clay courts, national clay courts. He beat me 6-4, and I made this assessment after the first set. I'm like, I can't play better than this, and I'm not sure I can hang here. So I started moonballing. I changed the game. I just changed the dynamic. I didn't think my A game was really going to do it. So I turned it into like a boys 12s match instead of a men's 35s and ended up winning with that style. And so to me, like that, for me, that was a good use of it. I also have another story where I was playing, I think, 45 nationals and I held back. And I was really upset after the match with myself. A lot of regrets about that. Um, Now, I did turn that into fuel to never play that way again and had a great summer. So, in the end, that loss was important to me because it it showed me what I never want to do again. Um, so I think there are different things that we can learn even through our regrets. If you play one of those types of matches, can you look at it and say, you know what, I never want to do that again. I've reached the low point, and then you got to change something. You got to start playing a little bit. We'll go back to Jeff Greenwald, play without fear, let it go, right?
Yeah, no, I think what's important is playing in a playing in a way that you think gives you the best possible chance. So whether there are all different types of players out there. So what we're not saying is that for everybody the way that you're going to play best is this really aggressive
Right.
way of going for everything. I think it's different for each person. You see that at every level that there are people that play more or less aggressive and all different playing styles within that. But whatever that playing style is that you are best at, and ultimately gives you that best chance, that's what you want to go down fighting with, not some playing style of just trying to going through the motions or just trying to get the ball in um, or on the other side of things, on the more aggressive side of saying, okay, I need to hit the world's biggest serves here or serve and volley on every point or whatever it is. But no, I think that's an important point. And I think as it relates to pressure, going back to that, I think as it relates to pressure, that's where you want to double down on that, where you want to really stick to those that playing style that you're best at. I got a great tip from one of my coaches growing up that a high pressure situation, a good play is to try to put pressure on the opponent. Right, they're probably feeling it too. Maybe it's a tiebreaker, or maybe it's late in the third set or whatever it is. Hey, maybe we want to come to net here and really put some pressure on the opponent and force them to come up with their best shot. Trying to, again, sort of shift our perspective from being stuck in our own heads, thinking about our own game and that pressure that we're experiencing, and recognizing that our opponent is feeling that as well. They must be in this moment. So let's put some pressure on them. Let's make them uncomfortable. Let's come up to net and put them in a position where they have to hit a passing shot, or they have to, maybe hit the type of shot that they're uncomfortable with.
And that's good use of tennis IQ level 3. Thinking more about the other side, how we make them uncomfortable, and absolutely make them come up with a shot under pressure. Um, Many people won't be able to do it. They may just hit a return in the net or miss it wide, or maybe they give you an easy volley, and then the point is over. So, Josh, should we transition now to talking about some good practices to prepare and then also how to handle pressure points?
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, So perhaps I guess I'll go back to that stress appraisal exercise and kind of complete the circle there. So we started off by listing out all the things that we're thinking about with respect to this upcoming match or this upcoming event. There's probably going to be some good stuff in there, probably mostly going to be things that are not helpful, not true, somewhat irrational. And so what we want to do is look at that, address it, notice that there's sources of interference, see where we can challenge some of those things. But then we want to create a new way of looking at it and um, call this the challenge mindset. And the idea is to embrace the challenge of this particular event or moment. And one of my favorite quotes with respect to this um, is from a guy named Carlos Castaneda, And this is comes from Toltec philosophy. Toltecs were a civilization in northern Mexico a long time ago. And I like to call this the warrior mindset. And so a warrior in the Toltec society was not necessarily somebody who just went to war, but it was someone who was always striving for personal freedom and to become the best person that they could become. And so the quote is this: the difference between a warrior and an ordinary person is that a warrior takes everything as a challenge, while the ordinary person takes everything as a blessing or a curse. And you could probably even find that ordinary person in your initial appraisal. Like, oh, it's this, this is going to be tough, or this sucks, or it's bad luck, or something. Or there might even be some of the good part, right? The blessing, about what's happening. But the warrior looks at it, just accepts it for what it is. This is an event. It's an important event for our team, or it's an important event for me. Great. I accept that. Now I want to embrace that challenge. I want to take it on. And then we have a series of questions that help people come up with essentially a pre-event self-talk plan that they can then use over the course of a couple of days or a week, in essence, to help make that their default thinking when someone brings up this event. And some of the questions are, what do you have to gain from this event? What could you improve? What can you control? What can you do to show others that you're embracing this moment? Those types of questions. And you get this like really cool paragraph when you read it. You're like, all right, wow, yes, I like this approach. This is a much better way of thinking about it because we're thinking more about, hey, I want to be in that situation. It's not so much about what can go wrong. It's like, hey, there is something in it for me, and it's this, and I want to approach that. I want to strive for that, and some of it would also be helping you to reduce the pressure of maybe potential consequences that go into this. And so this new way of looking at it, the embrace the challenge mindset, can really start to get you to now move away from the threat response, but okay, I want to be here. So what do I need to do now in order to start playing the way I want to play? I've created that mental space. I've removed some of that anxiety. Now I can actually focus on creating some of these outcomes.
Yeah, that's a couple things came to mind there. Number one is trying to see things as they are, right? So this non-judgmental way of viewing the situation and appraising the situation. So not, well, if you have a finals of a tournament, let's just say, or it's your conference tournament, we're not saying, hey, this is the most important match ever, or we're not lying to ourselves and saying, oh, this is just like any other match, but seeing things as they are. We're saying, okay, this is a big match, and that's what it is. To me, it reminds me of the inner game of tennis,
Yeah.
and trying to remove that judgment piece and just be able to see it as it is, and then we can respond in that best possible way. And then also where you're talking about that challenge mindset, I know Will Beauregard, who we had in a previous episode. We talked a lot about this, and we just talked about this when I was working at Sacred Heart, but being able to see things as a challenge or an opportunity rather than a threat. And I think as you break it down, you start to see that any sort of moment, any sort of challenge that can be faced can be seen in that way, can be seen as a challenge, or can be seen as an opportunity rather than a threat. And I think the big difference between those two sorts of mindsets is that when something's a challenge, when something's an opportunity, you're going to be leaning in. You're going to be eager for it. You're going to be excited about it. Where if it's a threat, you're going to be backing away. You're going to be fearful. You're going to think about what you have to lose rather than what you have to gain from the situation. So I think helping individuals to recognize that and to recognize that you have control over how you view the situation and where your attention is, and that also that we're not catastrophizing that, oh, if I lose this match or if we lose this tournament, that that this is all a waste or that I'll never have an opportunity like this again. Um, so I think that's a great way to look at things in terms of seeing things as they are, but also and not sort of viewing them through this putting our own spin on things in terms of making it bigger or smaller than it actually is, but seeing things non-judgmentally, but also viewing things as an opportunity or a challenge and trying to rise to the occasion rather than backing away and seeing it as a threat.
Yeah, I think that is like the basic behavior or basic difference between the two, right? Do we avoid negative outcomes, or are we going to try to approach positive ones?
Yep,
And
absolutely.
one sort of the avoiding, usually you'll notice that from the word don't. Don't do this, don't do that. I don't want to mess up. I don't want to double fault. I don't want to make a lot of mistakes. Versus do,
Sure.
and taking positive actions. Yeah, I want to work on my breathing. I want to focus on my game plan. I want to, have great body language when I'm out there. Those types of things, right? So you're actually giving yourself some things to do, and I think that can then, once you're able to get your head into that space of thinking about what you actually want and what's in it for you, then you can begin to put it into specific things you're going to do in order to get prepared for that event. And that also, this discussion can also be brought down into a point in a match, because we all know, we've been there. Get to, maybe if you're playing a no ad situation, automatically you might be thinking, all right, I can't screw this up, versus, all right, what do I need to do here to win this point?
Right.
And it just, I think a lot of this process is building self-awareness for how you think. And you mentioned earlier the idea of acceptance and not being non-judgmental. This is where a practice like meditation can help you be more of that noticer, that watcher of the thoughts. So it helps you kind of separate what you think from, just sort of yourself. Oh, that's just a thought. It's not me per se. It doesn't have to be true. It's just a thought. And the more that we notice it, like, oh, you know what? I'm thinking a little bit too much about what I don't want. I need to shift that. But if you don't have maybe that mental discipline built in yet, you may not be able to make that shift. And I think that's, when we did our mindfulness episode, that was one of the reasons that we advocated for mindfulness meditation as a practice for players, but actually everyone in general, so that they can understand a little bit more about how their own mind works, build some awareness of that, and then maybe make some changes about how that works, so that we start to get more of the things that we want in life, and not just thinking about what we don't want. So I think we can apply some of that to our preparation for the match ahead, or understand that in the moment, how are we thinking, how do we want to be thinking. You had mentioned earlier, like, could be thinking about these situations, and it made me think about Novak Djokovic, who, his use of visualization is putting himself into many different situations in a match, adverse situations, not all easy ones. And he puts himself in that situation. He sees himself succeeding there, so that when an actual tough pressure situation comes up, he's already thought about how he's going to handle it. He's not making it up in the moment what he wants to do, right? He's had this level of preparation and pre-planning. And by doing it through visualization, he can actually see it and feel it, and almost have this experience of, I've been here before. And so that's, another option as we prepare for things, is, can we be thinking not about just, hey, I want to play well, but all right, what are some of the things that could happen in this event that I want to be prepared for? What are some of the big moments? What do I want to do if I've got a break point against the opponent, right? I can break his serve. How do I want to handle that? How do I want to handle break points against me? How do I want to go into that closing game for the set or the match? And the more that we have prepared ourselves to be in those moments rather than, again, winging it when the moment occurs, the better we're going to handle that.
Yeah, yeah. I think the point about visualization and visualizing specific scenarios that are likely to occur. I mean, we see it with Djokovic, where he has this ability, I think, unlike any other player I've ever seen, to just not miss, to find a certain level where he can just not miss. And I think that's come out in certain matches where he's been down match points. I can think of a number of them. And he's able to find that level. And I think a big reason why is because through the visualization process, it essentially tricks your brain into thinking that it's already been through it. So you have a plan, you know how you're going to respond because to your brain, you've already been through that situation and you've practiced it, you've rehearsed that situation. I think as we're thinking about how to handle pressure in the moment, that preparation piece is such a big part of it. Rehearsing how we're going to handle that situation when it's deuce point, right? Whether it's at the college level, whether it's certain USTA matches, there's more and more no ad scoring now, which really puts the importance on that deuce point, that deciding point. That one point swings the game one way or the other. So can we prepare for that in terms of, do we have a certain pattern that we know we want to go to in that moment? So it clears that space for us. So we don't have to make a decision, okay, where are we going to serve here? Or what pattern are we going to go to? But we've already thought this out ahead of time and mentally prepared. And maybe we've prepared that on the practice court too.
Hopefully.
So I think that preparation piece of those big points is big, but also thinking, hey, if it's love 40 and I'm serving, what then? How are we going to handle that? Or even thinking, okay, if I'm playing and I'm really feeling nervous, I'm physically feeling nervous, my heart is pounding, maybe my palms are sweaty, I can literally feel my heart pumping. Maybe there's some mental rehearsal or imagery that we can do about actually that sort of scenario. But do we have a plan in place for calming ourselves down or getting ourselves into a frame of mind so that we can actually perform in that moment?
Yeah, so let's talk about that in the moment, because we might get into a fight or flight response.
Yep.
So what do we do? Because what are we experiencing? We're probably experiencing a little bit more stress. Our body's starting to feel more tense. Probably not thinking quite as well. We're probably rushing.
Yep.
What I normally see when people begin to get more nervous, they begin to rush from point to point. We might be looking all around rather than keeping our eyes fixed on certain things to control what we're inputting. And so there are, I think, some levers that we can pull here to begin to try to find ourselves again. And you mentioned it earlier, Josh. Breathing is probably the first thing that we want to start doing, is bringing back our awareness of our breath, breathing through the belly, through the diaphragm, exhaling through the mouth, dropping the shoulders as a way of beginning that relaxation response in the body. But it also helps to start to slow the thoughts in the mind down. Very often when we're in that fight or flight mode, our mind is really racing. It almost feels like the thoughts are just going a million miles an hour. We want to see if we can slow that down. I think another aspect that we can be doing in that moment is, can we start to shake the tension out of our body? That could be bouncing up and down, shaking out your arms. Could even do sort of a modified progressive muscle relaxation. Grip your racket really tightly, and then let it go and kind of shake out your arm. Right? Again, all about releasing tension, because what does tension do? Tension often will corrupt your technique. It will corrupt your rhythm, your tempo, and your balance. And if you've got a lot of tension, where it often manifests itself is in how you grip the racket. The tighter you grip the racket, it actually shifts the balance of weight in the racket from the tip of the head, and it usually brings it into the throat or the grip. Therefore, you've got less weight in the head. You can't create as much spin. You can't create as much power. And very often, just even the mobility of the racket may turn it into more of a trampoline than, than being able to exercise some control there. And when we grip that racket tightly and there's no weight in the head, very often the ball starts to land shorter and shorter and shorter, and we get attacked. So by trying to loosen things up over the course of several points, getting ourselves to, I like to use the metaphor, you want to feel like cooked pasta. You want to be nice and loose out there as much as you can. You loosen up the grip. That's a great place to start as well. Not to the point where your racket's going to fly out of your hand, right? But find that balance where you can control it, but it's also nice and loose, so that your arm starts to loosen up. So I think those are a couple good things, as well as then start to manage your body language. What image are you projecting here? Are you letting everybody know that you're struggling? Or can we start to take control of that and almost ooze this sense of calm and confidence in that situation? Kind of, I got this. I think it can be helpful sometimes to, when you're thinking about body language, how you walk around the court, watch how certain pros walk around the court. Now, a guy who I really like how he's walking around the court these days is Stefanos Tsitsipas. He's got a really good, confident walk. And you know what he does that I really like is he has like a little bit of an extra long stride. That just shows some real power and energy there, like some real swagger to how he walks. So even in those moments, hey, pretend you're your like favorite pro. How would your favorite pro handle this moment? Play as if you're Tsitsipas, Nadal, Djokovic, Serena, whomever, Naomi Osaka. Be them in that moment. There's actually, you've probably read some of this research, Josh, that when we play as if we're somebody else, when we're playing a role, we often perform better.
Gets us out of our own head, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to that. I think, we're going to feel more fluid. We're not going to be thinking about all the little intricacies of our swing that, our backhand that we're uncertain with, and where we're starting the swing and our hips and this and that, where we're in the moment, we're focused on one thing. I think back to the actual conversation with Sean Brawley, where we talked about, focusing on that most important thing, which is often the ball. Or this situation, we're talking about, feeling loose with our swing or how we walk around the court. So I think when we are emulating the pros and, trying to look like them in terms of our strokes, in terms of our body language, that it can definitely do a lot for our game and sort of how we portray ourselves to our opponent. And I think the body language piece is something that maybe isn't talked about enough, and I think certainly is something that players often aren't aware of enough. And I think it, especially in big moments, when somebody can see it on video, how they actually look and how they sort of that message that they're sending to their opponent on the other side of the net, that can make a big difference. Where if somebody can see, what am I looking like right now, you can often they can often recognize and make that change, because they see that, okay, I was rushing and I only took 4 seconds in between points here, or I kept my head down the whole time. I didn't look up at my opponent even once, or my shoulders were up by my ears and I looked very tense. So I think oftentimes when somebody is experiencing those nerves and they are rushing, that they're not aware of what their opponent might be seeing in that moment, or sort of the image that they're sending off to their opponent. So I think that body language piece is critically important because it's sending a message to the person on the other side. I mean, I often will say if somebody has weaker body language or they're getting frustrated, I'll say, hey, stop for a second. If you're playing somebody and they're throwing their racket or they seem nervous or they are acting that way, how do you feel? And they're like, I feel pretty good. That makes me feel more confident. So like, okay, so let's reverse that. When you're doing that to your opponent, how is that going to make them feel? So to be able to, I just think sort of shifting that perspective and again, broadening that perspective can help people recognize the importance of things like body language, things like, how we present ourselves. And I think, going back to, handling pressure in that moment, I think it's really important that we have that awareness of, what we're doing and what's going on around us, what's going on within us, how are we feeling, what are we thinking, being aware of that, but also being aware of our opponent certainly and the match in general. I think that those different levels of tennis IQ, going back to Jorge Capestani's original model, are most important at the match's biggest moments, at those most high pressure moments. I think that's really where we need to be able to slow things down and take that deep breath and be present and be aware of all these different levels of things.
Yeah, and I think something you're hitting on is also just like the importance of managing your time when you're doing this.
Right.
Using that routine so that you can not only be taking care of your body chemistry and how you feel, but then also getting your focus on what's actually important. Getting again onto the positive things that you want to do, where you want to serve, where you want to hit your return, what's that second ball look like, or what's the pattern I want to play here? Do I want to put pressure on the opponent, or do I want to make him or her hit a ton of balls? Maybe they have a low shot tolerance, so I'm just going to push them and make them work. Um, those things then, by using that time wisely between points, you can really, I think, handle pressure much better if you're, again, focused more on what you want to do and then getting your body to feel good in those moments. So I think that gets back to our discussion on routines, which we had a few episodes ago, and how important that is. And this might be an example of, I think we talked about yellow light routines. I like to think of big points as an opportunity to use your yellow light routine, which is where you take a little bit more time on that. So at least until you get really good at these pressure moments. So that could be for our listeners, if pressure moments are things that you struggle with, or like those deuce points, that is an opportunity to take some extra time before that point. Really think about what you want to do. Think about what your game plan is there. Get yourself feeling good, and then execute that play. Like you said, that you've either visualized and or also put it on the practice court, so that it's just, yeah, that's my play. But get yourself in the right frame of mind so you can do that. So I think these are all really good ways of getting yourself to perform better. They're not necessarily guarantees that you're going to be performing great under pressure right away, but they are the right things to do. And with practice, your performance under pressure will become better.
And I think another a last point maybe on this specific topic that I would add is we see the pros, male, female, whoever at even the highest levels of the sport will come off court and say, "Hey, I was feeling nervous. I was feeling the pressure."
Yeah.
Naomi Osaka, we just referenced this in our Australian Open recap. She was saying leading up to her final that she was feeling the pressure of that moment, even though she'd been in it before, even though leading up to that match she was 3-0 in major finals, she was feeling nervous. She was feeling that pressure. So I think, many top players have referenced that at times. So I think being able to, for our listeners who are most of whom not at that level, being able to not judge ourselves so much that if we are feeling that and recognize that, hey, everybody goes through this, even the best in the world. But rather than judging myself, how am I going to manage it? Do I have a plan to manage it? Maybe, and we've talked about some of the different pieces of that plan. Maybe that involves breathing. Maybe that involves some sort of self-talk and being able to sort of rationalize it with yourself in that moment. Maybe that involves your routine. In fact, I would say it should be a part of your routine. I think all these different pieces, the mindfulness or the breathing aspect, the self-talk piece, these other pieces that we referenced in our episode on routines, all fit into this. It fit into routines broadly. So I think having a plan so that it's not a matter of if you're going to get nervous and when, because it does happen to everybody at different times. So not judging ourselves in that moment, but rather, not focusing on that problem of the nerves or of the emotions, but rather thinking about the solution in terms of, okay, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah. And I think, matches probably have multiple pressure moments.
Yep.
And let's say you don't do well in the first couple. Don't be tricked into thinking it's a pattern.
Yep.
Just because you lose a couple deuce points doesn't mean, oh, I always lose the deuce point. She's winning all the deuce points. And I don't know, you hear that all the time. That, deuce points ends up becoming sort of the excuse of the day for why. But you knew the match was no ad. So we got to be ready for that situation. And even if you lose the first couple, so what? Try to learn from that. Try to be better at the next one. It doesn't mean just because somebody won a couple of deuce points that he or she is going to win all of them or going to win the majority of them. That can easily turn around. And I think we as humans sometimes start to create patterns and trends where they're really not there. And I think that's what our brains do. Our brains are really good at detecting patterns in things, and that's part of our higher level thinking. But sometimes it's a little too active, and if somebody wins a couple deuce points, that's not a pattern. That's 2 points. That's a very small sample size from a data perspective. You would never make any real life judgments based on 2 points of data. But tennis players or athletes will often do that. Even let's say you're a basketball player, you missed your first 2 shots. You might start passing the ball off more often. You don't want to take any more shots because you've missed the first couple. But we've got to keep going back out there. There are going to be more pressure moments in the match. We hope so. And let's just keep going at it the way we want to and learn from that process. I'd love to have somebody say, yeah, I lost the first couple deuce points, but then I won the rest of them. And that is all again about how our mind perceives things and the stories that we tell ourselves, which then end up driving certain emotions and certain behaviors. And so we just have to be very, again, watchful and observant for how we're thinking about pressure, so that when it really comes down to the business end of the match or of a set, we're in the right mindset so that we can perform like we want to.
Absolutely, and I think that all goes back to how are we appraising things, how are we viewing this moment, and I think that sort of ties into another point that I know we wanted to touch on, which is other people and how that ties in, whether those be our coaches, whether those be our teammates, whether those be parents, but other people's expectations or maybe perceived expectations, or the judgments or perceived judgments of other people, and how that ties into the pressure that we're experiencing, or sort of how we are viewing that moment in terms of how we're feeling in terms of the pressure, in terms of the sort of expectations that we're putting on ourselves, compared to maybe at times feeling like we have to perform well so that we're not letting down our teammates, or so that we're making our parents proud, or anything like that. Brian, where do you how do you view that when you work with athletes, and you hear things like that, in terms of, oh, I don't want to let down my teammates, or my parents are spending all this money on my training, or my coach has been working really hard with me. How do you help athletes with that process?
Yeah, it's funny. I had this conversation not with a tennis player, but the volleyball player yesterday. Obviously, there are some similarities with the scoring system between the two sports, and so she said that exact same things. Like, I don't want to let down my teammates and my coaches. So when I make mistakes and I don't play well, I'm afraid I'm letting them down. And I just asked a very simple question. It says, well, is that how you judge them? Do they disappoint you when they make mistakes? And it's like, oh, no. And so it really comes down to, what do we think is the true criteria that we need to live up to, that people will be proud of us? And I think it comes down to controllables. Do you have the right attitude when you go out and play? Like, a positive attitude. Do you give it your best effort? Are you focused on doing what you're supposed to do? Whether your process goals, or just following, your practice plan, or game plan for that particular day. Those are some, there probably are some other controllables that you could say, that may be just part of effort and focus. If you go out and do those things, I don't think anybody can really ask any more of you as an athlete. And so, Josh, if you and I are teammates and you're out there playing and you're giving it your all, great attitude and whatever, and for some reason you come up short, I'm not going to be like trashing you and be like, oh, I'm so disappointed in Josh.
My teammate just didn't have it today.
Yeah, although I have heard that. Maybe I told you that story. Um, um, Not a good teammate there, but most of your teammates and coaches are not going to judge you on that. They're going to know you left it all out there. Um, and then how could I ask of anything else of you? And then also, how could you ask of anything else of yourself? 'Cause we can't control the winning and losing. Well, we can control the losing probably, but we can't always control the winning, in matches that are competitive. And because if we could, then who would choose to lose? We'd all be undefeated at this point. So I think when we look at, um, what we can actually control in those situations, it's that effort, that attitude, body language, your breathing, all these little simple things. If you're doing those things, your teammates won't be disappointed, your parents won't be disappointed, your coaches won't be disappointed. If you lose, then we deal with that, and then we learn, and we move on to the next event. Um, so I think that is one aspect of, outside expectations, that sometimes we as people have this success criteria in our head that's faulty. We think it's all based on winning and losing, and that's what they're going to be disappointed in. That, or our parents are not going to love us as much if we're not successful. And generally that's just not true. And this brings us back, I think, to the whole expectations word that we brought up earlier with Ika Swiatek, and keeping expectations low or keeping them realistic. And I think if we bring it back to that and just simply focus on our own standards, then we can go out there and be proud of ourselves if we are able to maintain those standards and bring excellence to all the little things that we do that we think are going to lead to a good performance. That may also, go sort of maybe into a whole nother topic on focus on the process, but it's, if you know all the little details of your process and you can bring excellence to all those details, it's going to result in probably a pretty good performance. Again, not a guarantee of a win, but you're much more likely to win. Just thinking about winning and I should win or whatever, that doesn't tell you what to do. But if you just keep it real, keep your expectations low, and just focus on being the best you can be, having the best process that you know of, and bringing excellence to that, you're going to have a pretty good day.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to that theme that we often go to, this controlling the controllables theme, where some of the stuff might seem easier said than done, and it is easier said than done. But if you find yourself, it's a process. So if you find yourself thinking about these things out of our control, like our like your teammates, let's say, and how they're viewing you, or any of these other things out of our control during a match, or as you're competing, or even as you're practicing, being able to shift that attention and shift that focus onto something that is controllable. I think that skill in itself is one of the cornerstones, really, to me, of the mental game, of being able to shift that focus and time again go back to these things, go back to the present moment, and go back to these things that ultimately we can control and can influence.
Yeah. So fascinating discussion, Josh. Hopefully everybody got something out of that with respect to pressure moments, pressure events, how to handle those things, and so forth. So that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's show, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so that you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check us out on Instagram, where we're posting notifications of new episodes. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you again soon in our next episode.